I think more than ever we need grounded theory and grounded practice. And by that I mean we need theory that is based on the evidence of classrooms and schools, but we also need practice that is grounded in inquiry. And that's the way I think we make the connections between theory and practice. They shouldn't be separate, they should actually inform one another. You know, and I come back to the question that was posed yesterday, and I think it's a great question. And it's one I think that we should continue to return to because, you know, for every learner to walk the stage with dignity, purpose, and options. And it was the options thing that caught me. Because as some of you know, I started my teaching career in South Wales a long time ago now, it seems to me. And I started my career in a place called Mountain Ash, and if that conjures up any romantic images, please dispel them at once. Michelle knows where it is. It's opposite the largest furnace-site plant in the country. It was an area of huge socioeconomic deprivation. And for me as a young teacher going into that school, I think I just did not realize that the playing field was far from level for certain young people from certain backgrounds. And I learned very quickly that if you didn't have a good education, then your options were actually really rather small. And the powerful relationship between socioeconomic deprivation and subsequent educational achievement is still there. It is still powerful. We can break it, but actually it takes a lot. It takes a pretty special school to do that. So if we want every learner to walk the stage with dignity, purpose, and to have options, then what do we need to do? What do we need to achieve? And I come back to Kaiser and Halbert. You may know them. They're pretty big in Wales right now. And somebody tells me they're pretty big in BC too. But it comes back to this, and Stephanie alluded to it as well. It comes back to the core moral purpose. You know, what do we actually believe? And we believe we can make a difference, yeah? That's why we're here. And in England right now, we've got, I don't know what sort of government you would call it, really. It's, I think Gordon Brown could have done with some leadership training, just a little tiny bit. You know, there's an example of a leader who just stayed on too long, yeah? And probably should never been, never have the top job. Anyway, enough of Gordon Brown. We've got a hybrid government at the minute, it seems to me, conservative and liberal Democrats. A little bit of a mess in so many respects. But what we're seeing, and I guess you might be experiencing it here as well, is a sort of retrenchment happening. We're experiencing huge cuts in professional development, and we're seeing a profession that's beginning to back off and back away. I think at that sort of time, it's absolutely pivotally important that we retain the moral purpose, because the terrain out there is going to be difficult. The political terrain is going to be hard. So we need to hang on to what matters. And for me, it's this notion of having an absolute conviction and a belief that every young person should succeed irrespective of where they come from. And I guess you believe that too, right? I'm also sort of struck by what was said yesterday by Faye, the notion that strategies without purpose don't count. And that's right. Because right now, what I know is in England, there's some civil servant sitting in a dark room thinking up the next educational strategy, yeah, that is blatantly silly, that blatantly won't work, but will be imposed on teachers in a way that they can't resist. And what we see from all the evidence around the world is, you know, so many school improvement strategies that haven't made a difference to the classroom where it matters most. So this notion of strategies without purpose, and I would add without moral purpose, don't count. And my only bit of advice to the teachers and the head teachers in England is when the silly strategies come, resist them or undermine them, because they'll compete for time, energy, and resource that should be spent on classrooms. Yes? To show that I am a researcher, I thought I'd show a graph. In the 370-page CV, which I wrote myself. You know, clearly research is important. And I just want to show this graph. And the important lines to focus on are the solid blue line. These are high socioeconomic kids from wealthy backgrounds with an early sort of starting point in terms of their abilities, and the broken red line, which is the same, which is a group of children from low socioeconomic backgrounds with a high ability. And look at what happens. Those lines cross. So the important point here is if you happen to come from a certain sort of background where there are socioeconomic indicators of deprivation, etc., then it seems to me that your life chances, your options, can be significantly reduced. Whereas on the opposite side, the social capital that you have by virtue of coming from a high SES background can actually give you an advantage over and above your ability. So for me, that's the nature of the problem. How do we resolve that? How do we ensure that those kids who are on that broken red line do not go downwards, but stay upwards and go even further than those on the blue line? It's about ensuring success for each student in each setting. Not some students in some settings, but each student in each setting. And the sociologists that I work with, who are very clever at the London Institute, say to me, well, you know, Alma, that is just not achievable. You know, we know the impact of social deprivation on subsequent performance, so really, you need to lower your aspirations. And I say, okay, well, if that isn't the case, which children do we choose to fail then? Which ones do we say you haven't got any option? Which ones do we say to, which children do we say, actually, you know, you can't have an education? So I guess I hold on to that. And maybe it is a wild aspiration, but I think it's a wild aspiration worth having. Don't you? Because unless we believe that, what are we actually doing? And if one child, it seems to me, succeeds against the odds, then, you know, we've done our job. So we need to have this absolute conviction and moral purpose that we can make a difference, and we do make a difference, and it is for every child in every setting, not for some children in some settings. And how do we, this is Michael Fulham, how do we raise the bar and close the gap? I was in a conference quite recently with Michael, and he says, you know, many academics have managed to actually close the bar. That was interesting. And I'm afraid I think I was one of them. But there is a sort of very important point is, you know, how do we do that? How do we not just actually raise the level of achievement of all young people, but actually close that gap that we saw very clearly in that graphical representation? And you know, Michael is a great friend of mine, and I think he is an inspiration. I'm not stalking him. And, you know, I listen to him very often, and, you know, he is a guru of change, isn't he? A leading light of change. And one time I heard him speak on a public platform, and he said, you know, people call me a guru of change. He said, and my definition of guru is somebody who simply cannot spell charlatan, which I thought was an interesting notion. I don't think he is a charlatan. He says things more succinctly and eloquently than I ever could. But how do we actually close this gap? How do we, if we're serious about the moral purpose, if we're serious about all children in all settings, how do we actually close the gap? Well, one of the ways I think that we can close the gap is through building powerful networks of professional practice. Because as the politicians come for teachers from whichever political persuasion, then we are better and stronger together than we ever are apart. So the network isn't just a nice thing to do. It's an absolutely necessary thing to do if we are going to protect the profession from A, silly initiatives, and B, from erosion of confidence from politicians and, you know, accountability systems and standardizations and all the other things that have damaged the profession. So where do we need to go? Well, it seems to me we talked yesterday about needing to go deeper, and we do. We need better learning outcomes for all children. But we also need to go wider and think about our networks in a slightly different way, across district and actually across countries. And we also need to think about sustainability the notion of how do you sustain these networks over time. Because actually, if these networks are going to do the good work that your networks are doing, they can't just be one-off initiatives. They have to be sustainable over time. So, my talk today is in two halves. The first half is going to be about leadership, of which I think I know something. You may tell me otherwise. And I'm going to argue that what we need to be doing is mobilizing both informal and formal leadership. And then the second part is very much about creating stronger communities and building communities within schools, between schools, and across schools. And I'll allude to some of the work that we're doing in Wales. And again, Stephanie said, you know, invest in your own backyard. And I'm thinking, yeah, actually, that's right now, that's what I'm doing for the first time. And it feels incredibly good to be doing that, putting something back into an education system when I took quite a lot from it. So, some questions to start off with. If we're thinking about leadership, how do we ensure that leadership actually impacts on learning? What do we need to know about that form of leadership? What do leaders do when they make a difference to learning? Because, you know, there is a lot written about leadership and management. People like me have spent years delineating the difference between leadership and management. And it's actually really rather simple. Management is about maintenance. It's keeping the organization exactly where it is. Leadership is about development and taking the organization to new heights. You need both. In my view, most universities are overmanaged and under-led. There may be some schools just like that. But we need leadership because leadership is the energy and the driver that will take the organization to the next level. But in schools, what are we leading for? You know, when I was a leader in a university, someone told me, you know, just because you're the leader doesn't mean that anyone is following you. And you may have experienced this yourself. And it's sort of true, isn't it? You know, and I remember what used to happen to me. I was head of department. You know, Monday morning used to come along, and there'd be a knock on my door, and I'd have my list of things I was going to do that day. A knock on my door. Someone would come in. They say, "Alma, I've got a problem." I say, okay, we'll sit down and talk about it, because I thought that's what leaders did, okay? There's a Gordon Brown model of leadership. Yes, sit down and tell me about it. And then, by some sort of strange osmosis, they went out and I'd have the problem. Yeah? And then by the end of the day, I had about 20 of these problems to sort out, and my list was getting longer and longer. And I realized that that's not what leadership is. Leadership is actually empowering others to solve their problems. So I learned very quickly that when they say I have a problem, I would say, and how are you going to solve that? I then call it distributed leadership.